I'm Dave George. I'm the Associate Director of the Release Aging People in Prison campaign. I'm here on behalf of myself and Mr. Saldana, who is less of a glutton for punishment than most of us in the cheap seats are and went home to New York City. We at the Release Aging People in Prison campaign, to our knowledge, are the only criminal justice reform campaign in the country with the central focus of releasing older and aging people from prison and promoting public safety and racial justice as a means to end mass incarceration. I'd like to just talk briefly about what we see as the crisis of aging and older people in our state prison system in New York, touch a little bit about what's included and what's not included in the governor's executive budget proposal, and then talk about what we see as the clear path forward to safely and fairly release older and aging people from prison. Aging in prison is the inevitable result of long prison sentences and frequent parole denials after people who have been inside for decades. Like those of us in the outside community, people in prison age over time. And so when they're given 25 years to life and serve 25 years and then are frequently denied parole over years and decades, they, like the rest of us, get old, and some of them die in prison. So in New York State, we have the 5th highest number of life sentences in the entire country, of roughly 9,000 people serving a life sentence. Roughly 1,000 of those people are sentenced to life without parole or virtual life without parole. They will never appear in front of a parole board, and short of clemency will never be released from prison until they die. And when those people don't have any fair, meaningful opportunity for release based on who they are today, they age inside, and the result is what we have today, and that is 10,000 older and aging people in prison. 10,000 great-grandmothers and grandfathers, sisters and brothers who are away from their families, many of whom have been away from their families and communities for decades. And unfortunately, the governor's executive budget proposal does not get at any of these issues or crises. And there are 2 relevant components. The first is something that I believe was addressed earlier in the hearing, and I was pleased to hear it was addressed about, which is staffing of the state parole board. So in the governor's executive budget proposal, there is money allocated for only up to 16 parole commissioners, not a fully staffed parole board of 19. As most, if not all of you know, our parole board is woefully understaffed at this moment. We have 12 parole board commissioners who see 12,000 parole applicants every year. That leads to serious issues that I don't have to go into here, and I'm sure you all can understand. But ultimately, we need an extra $305,000 in the executive budget so that we can have a fully staffed parole board of 19 commissioners. And the second relevant component in the budget is the governor's compassionate parole proposal. I detail an analysis and recommendations for that proposal that I won't get into right now. I'll just say it is, in summary, a small, narrow, and exclusionary extension of the state's medical parole program for older people who are super sick. I don't believe at all that it gets at the crisis of aging in prison. And the truth is, even if we cleaned up the medical parole program and statute in New York State, which I think we should do, and I hope to work with you all on, it wouldn't get at the crisis of older and aging people in prison, because most are not deathly ill and dying inside. Most have some chronic condition, but wouldn't be qualifying for this sort of program. And that's why we need broader parole reforms. And for us, that means a 3-fold process. One is fully staffing the parole board with commissioners who actually believe in the concept of rehabilitation and come from professional backgrounds that allow them to assess it. 2 is Senator Gustavo Rivera's fair and timely parole bill that would change the parole release process to ensure that it's not exclusively based on the nature of the crime, but instead based on rehabilitation and who a person is today. And 3 is Senator Hoylman and Assemblymember Weprin's elder parole bill to establish a consideration of parole release for older people who have served 15 or more years. A reasonable person might say, those sound pretty easy, we should just do those. I think fundamentally, what we all have to grapple with as advocates, as a state, as legislators, is that these issues fundamentally butt up against the question of violence. And if we're serious about ending mass incarceration in New York State, we need to talk critically and seriously and differently about violence. And not just because of our value set, not just because we believe in redemption and compassion and mercy, but also for 3 reasons that I think we don't talk about enough. One is locking people up and throwing away the key does not keep us safer. We have decades of evidence that shows that the death penalty and life without parole does not deter crime, does not keep us safer. Two is, for most victims and survivors of crime, the lock them up and throw away the key approach doesn't work. It doesn't promote healing, it doesn't promote accountability, it doesn't give most victims and survivors what they want, and there is national research to back that up. Three is, practically 2/3 of our state prison system have been convicted of some form of violence. I think by most measures, ending mass incarceration means reducing the state prison population by more than 1/3. If we're serious about that from a numbers and practical perspective, we have to grapple with this question of violence. So I think it is incumbent upon all of us in this new political moment to grapple with these questions together, to move forward with the proposals that we just presented and the proposals that I outlined in our testimony. And I look forward to working with you all this session and having a productive year. Thank you.
Whoever.
Good evening. My name is Doug Van Zandt. As I said earlier, I'm with the New York Campaign for Alternatives to Isolated Confinement. 4 years ago, my son died in a New York State prison. He hanged himself while in solitary confinement. He was the victim of a horrible disease, a mental illness. He suffered from severe depression. We did not know about that, but he was put into a prison after starting a fire in a building, and once he was put on the psychotropic medications, he was stabilized, and we had hopes for his recovery. The prison system chewed him up and killed him, in my opinion. My wife and I lost our only son, and it is just a horrible thing. Within a year of him being in prison, he was sexually assaulted, and as a result, he was put into solitary confinement. Docs did not follow the shoe exclusion law. They were to limit the amount of solitary confinement that he was in, even though he shouldn't have been in solitary confinement at all. They sentenced him to 70 days. But thankfully, due to legislators like yourselves who we asked for help, he was limited and taken out of solitary confinement. He was moved to a different facility where he was put in a unit for the mentally ill. He was put back into the general population. He was accosted by gang members, made to transport drugs. He ended up going to a Fishkill correctional facility where he was assaulted by corrections officers. He was re-diagnosed as a young man with a personality disorder instead of a serious mental illness, and he was taken off his psychotropic medications cold turkey. He was then accused of fighting, which he'd never been in a fight in his life. He was put into solitary confinement, and he saw absolutely no hope, and he hanged himself. I'd like to talk about the problem of solitary confinement. As you all know, this is all. We've talked about this before. 3,000 to 4,000 New Yorkers are in solitary confinement on a given day. Most of them are minorities, African American, Latinx, and many of them have mental illnesses. It's commonly said that if you don't have a mental illness, when you go into solitary confinement, you will develop one. And that is absolutely true. And my son had a mental illness to begin with. And not only that, his mind was abused by being taken off the psychotropic medications. The cure for solitary confinement is the HALT bill. Humane alternatives to long-term solitary confinement. It does not eliminate solitary confinement, but it limits it to 15 days maximum. Solitary confinement was started by the Quakers several hundred years ago, who soon found out that solitary confinement did absolutely no good. But somehow it had continued and is now a tool that is used by the corrections officers. We also, in the HALT bill, we ban certain vulnerable groups. One of them is those with mental illnesses, diagnosed mental illnesses. Other groups, such as the very old, the very young, and other groups are also prohibited from being in solitary confinement. It's just common sense. The main part of the HALT bill is it provides alternatives that result in rehabilitation and treatment. They look at the underlying causes. The main part of the HALT bill will be the RHUs, rehabilitation units, which the incarcerated will go to instead of solitary confinement, so the damage will not be any further. Governor Cuomo's proposed his own HALT bill, which is basically the same language as ours, but it is completely watered down. It is, I don't think I need to go much further.
No,
but
actually, you can't because your time is up.
Oh!
So we just have time for questions.
Okay, thank you very
All right.
much.
So I don't know if you were expecting to speak, but you ran out of time.
That's okay.
Wait,
He didn't
that's
speak. He
that's what
didn't
I mean.
speak.
Which organization are you with?
I'm with the Halt Solitary campaign.
Okay, thanks. All right, so let's jump to questions then. Senator Hoylman.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's a pleasure to see you. I hope your advocacy day was successful on RAP, the bill that I carry with Assemblymember Weprin, and I'll be working closely with Senator Sepulveda on it. Could you just share with us the cost estimates of what the legislation to end elder parole would save the taxpayers of New York?
Yeah, sure. So, a couple of things. We have the highest state prison costs per incarcerated person per year in the country. It's $60,000 a year to incarcerate a person of any age in New York State every year. For older people, that's 2 times more. So it's $120,000 to $240,000 a year to incarcerate an older and aging person in prison. If we release just 10 more older people, we'd save $1 million, and we can reinvest that money in any of the programs or policies you all are pushing, which would probably do your constituents and your districts a ton of good.
Any other questions, Senator? Oh, Senator Jamal Bailey.
There we go. Just wanted to say thank you for sticking it out with us this long, and thank you for your advocacy on your legislation. And I just wanted to say, I certainly stand in solidarity with you in terms of how we should fully staff the parole board, as we discussed at length. We have so many issues and concerns with people who are overworked, and whether you agree with their decisions always or not, we have to keep in mind that these are people and they're not machines, despite what we may think of them to be sometimes. Well. And I certainly stand with the assessment, with your statements that we should be fully staffing the parole board, and I don't want to, continue to belabor points, but I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. Senator Zelnor Myrie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to echo what Senator Bailey said. Thank you for sticking it out. I think it is really unfortunate that we do not have the death penalty on the books here in New York, but in effect, that's what we are doing to folks. And I think it's important to say that and get that on the record, because we are sentencing people to death by not being gracious in how we release folks as they age. And I'd also like to say that solitary confinement is cruel and unusual, and it's something that I was proud to vote on in the Codes Committee. And look forward to supporting going forward in the Crime Victims Committee. My apologies. So thank you very much for your advocacy, and we look forward to working with you.
Thank you.